Imagine meeting a person who has a keen eye for detail, or one who has a quick mind for scientific studies, or a creative spirit for artistic expression. Now imagine a person with all those abilities and more. Such a person actually existed: Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci, a 4-hour documentary directed by Ken Burns, Sarah Burns, and David McMahon, begins at 8 p.m. November 18 here on PBS Fort Wayne. And we'll begin our discovery of Leonardo in conversation with a member of Purdue Fort Wayne's Department of Art and Design on this week's Primetime. And good evening, I'm Bruce Haynes. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen J. Cody, Associate Professor of Art History at Purdue Fort Wayne. Steve, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
This is a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
I'm really thrilled.
And the big canvas in which to have the chance to paint a sense of understanding regarding a man who's been described as an astonishing virtuoso, a gifted polymath, and the original Renaissance man. That's my favorite. Who is Leonardo da Vinci to you?
That's an interesting question. I think I would answer it differently depending on when we're talking about in terms of like my history, my life and stuff like that. So when I was like a very young person, like a child, right? Mm-hmm. I absolutely loved the Ninja Turtles, and I am 100% convinced that this is how I ended up studying Italian Renaissance painting. Is like I just like love the Ninja Turtles, and like Leonardo was like my favorite character, and so he sort of stands out in some respects for that. The more I grew up, the more I started studying art history and learning about this fascinating period we call the Italian Renaissance, the more Leonardo came to embody so many of the key trends of this period, the key features that emerge in this moment in human history. And it has a lot to do with his intellectual inquiry, the way he's exploring different facets of the natural world for the sake of painting. I think very recently, what he has been someone who thought deeply about issues of light, shadow, and optics, like the science of sight, and thought about ways of using that type of scientific inquiry to make paintings even more compelling, and that radically changed the world for his contemporaries, for his followers. And I've done some work on one of his like really closest followers and interlocutors, an artist named Andrea del Sarto that is near and dear to my heart. And that's been where Leonardo's like sort of lived in that part of my mind for a while. Is like this intellectual who's interested in sight and light and things like that.
And in light of your answer, this is the unfair question of, can you even give a brief overview of the life of Leonardo da Vinci?
I can certainly try. I can certainly try. So when we talk about Leonardo, we're talking about someone who was born in 1452. And he's born in or around a town called Vinci. In fact, that's where we get like the Da Vinci in his name. It's not actually a last name. It's just that it's a way of indicating where he was born. Mm-hmm. He was born not to a kind of well-off family, not to a noble household. He was born to a peasant woman and as the illegitimate son of an individual of note, a notary, in fact. He's then raised in his father's household with the other legitimate children of his father, and we don't know too much about his upbringing at this point. We know that he had some education, a sound, what we would call probably like elementary education. He was literate, but he didn't read Latin. He became bookish, but maybe didn't like read systematically the way someone who was like trained in a scholarly sense would be, right? Mm-hmm. By 1467, he is apprenticed to a workshop in Florence, and this is where he learns like the real like techniques of his trade. The workshop is run by an artist named Andrea del Verrocchio, and he's an important figure in the history of Florentine art. He's the leader of like really one of the most prestigious workshops. It specializes in sculpture, but it also does painting. And Leonardo would have learned both fields. I mean, he really excelled in painting. Drawing above everything else really was like where Leonardo lived and breathed, I think. He joins the workshop late. 15 is relatively late to begin your apprenticeship in Renaissance Italy. Like usually you begin much earlier. And, you know, true to fact, Leonardo stayed later than we would expect too. He stayed affiliated with Verrocchio's workshop for about 10 years and probably became something like a junior partner. And this brings us, you know, into like the 1470s where we have a few works by Leonardo. It's kind of shrouded in mystery and shadow, this early part of his career. It's not until 1480 or so that he begins to really emerge in the documentary record. This is where he's accepting more public commissions in Florence. But one of the facts about Leonardo is that even when he's accepting public commissions, he's leaving them unfinished. 1481, he leaves Florence and leaves these commissions unfinished because he gets what he sees, I think, as a better opportunity. He travels north. He travels to Milan. And he is there with the intent of becoming a court painter, which is a different type of way of existing. Like, you're attached to a noble household there, and it's like, frankly, a sweet gig. He spends the next 20 years in Milan, and when he's there, he's engaged in a variety of different endeavors. We're talking paintings, of course, sculptural projects, architectural studies, studies of human anatomy, things like hydraulics, you know, the study of like water systems and machinery, because he's got to do a number of different things as a court painter, not just paint. Like, he's really an official of this part. He leaves Milan right around the year 1500. And it's not his choice. The French invade and the situation becomes precarious in Milan, and he's kind of like, well, let's go. At this point, he becomes kind of itinerant. He bounces around the main centers of Italy. He spends time in like a city called Mantua. He spends time in Venice. He goes to Rome. He's in and out of Florence. He joins the retinue of the army of Cesare Borgia, who is the son of the Pope at this point, which is an interesting kind of thing to think about, right? He's there as the architect and general engineer of the Borgia army, so he's in charge of like maintaining like weaponry and thinking about how you move forces from one area to the next. I mean, he's studying. He's creating paintings, but he's studying things like human anatomy, optics, you know, again, like mechanics, all these different forms of knowledge that he's really like investigating. He does this bouncing around until about 1515. And there we start to get indications that his health is failing. The whispers appear in the documentary record. By 1516, he accepts the invitation of the King of France to join the French court, and so he relocates to France. He brings a couple of unfinished paintings with him, notably like the Mona Lisa, right? But he doesn't really paint much at this point. And here we have more evidence that his health is declining. Like we hear, I think in a letter, they're talking about like paralysis of a hand, which imagine what that does to a painter. There's thought that maybe he suffered a stroke. And he's there at the French court really as like a sage on a stage. He's there as an intellectual, as someone who can converse in a variety of different fields of inquiry and learning and do so very compellingly. And this is something that really works well at a courtly environment. He does this until he dies at 1519, or in 1519. And there he stands until he becomes, again, a Ninja Turtle and inspires me. But, yeah.
And from 1519 to 2024, it seems we can't escape that kind of time travel. The Renaissance enthralls us. Raphael and Michelangelo and Galileo, and then Leonardo da Vinci. And there's this Mount Rushmore quality of these individuals alone, if not more. What is it about that time that still attracts us modern day audiences?
So we're talking about the Renaissance as a whole and what makes it compelling from the standpoint of modern audiences. I think we look at this moment as like the beginning, and this is something that goes back to like the 19th century, the beginning of like modernity as a whole, the beginning of when we, like the traditional old view, and I'm not saying that this is the correct view, this is just one of those things that's like baked into Western consciousness. We look at this as the beginning of when like, you know, humanity acquired a shape and a character that we might call modern, that seems and feels like it exists today. And they start to maybe like question received wisdoms and dogmas and embrace maybe some form of like, say, scientific method of inquiry. And Leonardo is certainly like someone who does that, and he has that scientific impulse in spades. I think also, you know, when we talk about the Italian Renaissance, like I think, and especially the art, right? Like we are talking about some of the most remarkable, famous creations in human history. We're talking about creations that really like, you know, kind of figure prominently in what we would call the classical tradition, broadly conceived. For a long time, you had people living who were looking back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece as the very pinnacle of what humanity could achieve, as like, you know, they did it better. And it's a new idea to think about like the future as this infinite possibility, right? As like, you know, something better than the past. But so little exists in the world of things like ancient painting. And so the Renaissance substitutes for that by recovering so many of those cultural traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. And so they've always held a certain sheen, these figures, this time. And that hasn't completely evaporated. in today's world, I don't think.
Yeah.
I hope not. But.
I am noticing additional attention being paid to sort of an unofficial work of art, which would be Leonardo's notebooks. We were seeing some images of those as you were sharing about the importance of this time frame. These pages seem to be the artist talking out loud to himself. But boy, his illustrations are nobody's able to capture. You really feel like you're right there, and he is truly to detail, reflecting what he's seeing.
Yeah, that's very astute observation. I think like his notebooks, they were largely unknown until about the 19th century. Like they weren't like completely unknown. They just have a very weird and kind of shady history around them in terms of like what happened after like Leonardo died. They're passed to the hands of one of his principal pupils who kind of edits them and publishes them, and then they kind of circulate, but in a form that maybe Leonardo wasn't necessarily the author of. He is someone who recorded so much in these notebooks over the course of his life, and I think there's one very famous Leonardo scholar who refers to them as a chaos of intelligence, and I love that description because it describes perfectly what he's doing. You have these really detailed anatomical studies where he is interested in the bone structure of the human body and the way muscles overlay the bone and the sinews that connect them, but then also the nerves that do this. And he's prioritizing real, natural, like physical observation. Like, can you see it with the naked eye before the microscope? Like, he's observing the world in this capacity, and he's thinking about that from the same standpoint as he's thinking about plant life, and he's thinking about like the way water flows, and he's thinking about the flights of birds. And so you get the sense of the notebooks, the more that comes to light, the better we understand how they're ordered and what they were. You really sense that mind at work as what you're describing. Some passages in there are definitely drafts for publications that he was intending. Almost you can imagine him speaking to a reader. Some are, I think, more private and reflective, but like always there's that active, agile, deep thinking mind that is, such an important part of who he was.
And when we are exposed to his works, of which there were not as many in volume, but they were certainly significant in terms of one to another, beyond Mona Lisa, probably the party question is, quick, name at least one other work by Leonardo da Vinci. You'd like to draw us to that one work, and that's The Last Supper. Yeah,
I like The Last Supper, Leonardo's Last Supper, because I think it captures a lot of of who Leonardo was as an artist, right? Like, the good, the bad, and the kind of the technically shady is the way we might describe it. So when we talk about The Last Supper, I think we need to begin thinking about this from the standpoint of subject matter and setting. This is a painting he paints on a wall, and it's in a wall in a monastery. It's in a religious space meant primarily for a religious community to view. And this is in a space where they are going to take their meals. This is what we call a refectory, basically like their cafeteria. So the subject of the Last Supper of Jesus and his apostles makes a great deal of sense for where we are, right? And the way Leonardo paints it, you can see that like Jesus and his disciples sit on one side of a table as if they're at the very head of the room. Believe it or not, this is actually pretty fitting for the way tables would be laid out in this space. Like you would have a head table that would look out at the rest of the hall. It's not like Jesus and his friends came in and said, "Excuse me, we'd like a table for 26. Oh, but there are 13 of you. No, we're going to sit on one side, right? This fits, this works. And then like it's a moment that comes right from the Bible, that we have Christ gathering with his principal followers, his 12 apostles, for the very final meal he's going to have before he's crucified. And he does a couple of important things at these moments. And the thing that like Leonardo seizes upon is he announces that one of those apostles is going to betray him. And like this is the moment Leonardo chooses to represent. And like you can see what he's doing here is he's exploring the capacity for human drama and dynamism in the work. And this is something Leonardo really contributed to the history of Renaissance painting. It's energy, it's drama. It's like you can see the figures move and the way they bend, and it reveals the inner workings of the soul. So you have Christ stable in the very center of the painting. Mm-hmm. He forms this perfect triangular shape. He's calm, collected. He's like the eye around which the storm swirls, because you have the rest of the apostles, and immediately close to them you have the scatter shot, where you have people like kind of bending forward or leaning back and gesturing wildly. Do you see what he heard? And the outer groups, they're kind of gesturing back in. They're like, oh my God, did you hear him? One of us is going to betray him. Who's it going to be? Right? Now, Leonardo was thinking about how do you create that type of figural energy, that drama? And then how do you control it? Because it has to be clear as much as it has to be compelling a painting. And true to his form, because he was someone who had this very agile mind, he invests his compositions with mathematical values. So Christ in the center takes this perfect triangular shape. The 12 figures around him, 4 groups of 3. And you can see how like they form these groups, and you get the energy, but then also like the kind of regularity and the harmony of the whole composition. And you even get the mathematical system of the perspective that's there, because this is, again, what Leonardo knows so well. It all leads, the lines of the perspectival system lead our eye directly back to Christ. And so it's a way of focusing our attention and the energy on the image where it needs to be focused. That's what he does compositionally in terms of the figure. I could talk about this more in terms of, like, say, light, shadow, color, and then technique if we have time.
I noticed that those elements are not only found in the Last Supper, but also in some of the other paintings you bring, particularly with the notion that it isn't just painting one color in one space and we're moving on, right. That there is this layering effect of painting paints that are somewhat translucent and providing depth that hadn't necessarily been seen in art at that time until then.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think there might be like 2 images of like the figure of Gabriel somewhere circulating, if those are around. But
yeah, let's look. We have the Adoration of the Magi and the Annunciation, which would.
Let's start with the Adoration of the Magi.
All right.
That's a good one. And so when we're looking at the Adoration of the Magi, again, we're talking about a very complex pictorial like composition with a lot of figures gesturing emphatically. But what I want to point to is the fact that this is one of those images, like so many of Leonardo's, that is unfinished. And so what we get him doing here is he's prepared a panel, a wooden panel. He's established a type of tonal ground so that you see that he's working on a field of like browns and neutrals. And what that does is that allows him to play with highlights and shadows so that you can build out to highlights and then push down to shadow. It gives you greater range and flexibility. He then lays his drawing, his design on the panel, and he begins painting. And the first strokes of his brush, they're not articulating color. They're beginning to kind of like apply these deep swatches of inky shadow across the composition to lay in the shadows so that his figures are going to materialize, emerge from them fully illuminated as he applies later coats of painting one on top of the next, adding more information, more values, more color. And then if we were to say transition to the Annunciation and look at the figure of Gabriel there,
okay,
you could see sort of something like maybe a finished result. Because if you look at the figure of Gabriel, and that's the angel off to the left side of the Annunciation, he's kneeling forward. And you can see that like in his like chest and in his lap, he has those deep inky shadows that are so familiar from Leonardo's works. But then as you move into like, say, around that red skirt that he's wearing, the deep saturated reds exist in the middle tones. It's light reveals color. And prior to Leonardo, artists were really using color as a way of articulating light, so that it was actually in the shadows where you would have the reddest areas, the most saturated, deepest colors were in the shadows. Leonardo's like, that's not how reality works. Light reveals color. And this method of painting that he develops, it's called chiaroscuro. He's applying oil paints, so that allows him to layer colors. This allows him to treat color very differently, allows him to treat light very differently than what his predecessors were doing. And it gives you that greater sense of three-dimensionality that, frankly, like, it was a game changer for artists at this point in history. Like, after Leonardo, you have to reckon with these innovations. Even if you reject them, you have to reject them from the standpoint of understanding. Like, you can't ignore them, basically.
Of course, the one for which we all have the image in some part of our mind is that of Mona Lisa. I was surprised to learn that this was a work over 16 years. And while some have described it as the perfect painting, which I'm sure is a topic of debate among art historians everywhere, what is that magnetic quality for us? Is she smiling? Is she not smiling? She looks dimensional. She doesn't look dimensional. What time has done to the colors of the work? But we all show up with our cell phones, and we're determined to prove that we made it to the Louvre, and we.
Yep, and you're there surrounded by all the crowds.
We got our 15 seconds, and we got our picture.
So, you know, the Mona Lisa is fascinating. I think it really rose to prominence by the fact that it was like stolen and then returned and recovered, and so there's a whole mystique around that, right? But the more you look into the history of it, the more it becomes itself a type of enigma, a mystery that is almost aligns with the figure of Leonardo himself, right? Like, so it begins in a very traditional sense, probably as a portrait. And what we have is, you know, near contemporaries saying that it was a portrait of a nobleman's wife in Florence. You know, they called her La Gioconda, which means like, you know, like joke play, and that idea of like her smile, the coy smile there is a play on the kind of name that we would have associated with this. But then Leonardo never delivers the painting. And he may have begun it as early as 1503, and then he just like, you know, gets sidetracked and pulled in these many different directions as Leonardo does, and he keeps it with him. And he keeps working on it. And so he has it with him when he goes to France, and he's working, returning to it again and again consistently. And the idea is that perhaps, this is the way it was like taught to me, for example, is that as he continues to work on it, it becomes less of a portrait, more of a study in his particular ideal for art and painting, all the values that he's most interested in. And so you get that sense of like, you know, a figure sitting in that very nice triangular shape, balanced, stable, harmonious. You have her sitting on a kind of darkened balcony. Like you could just make out the columns that have been cut down on the side. And then what would have been a bright environment behind her, we shouldn't be able to see her so clearly. But Leonardo is someone who has studied like the science of sight and optics, is thinking like, I could describe something naturalistically that breaks the rules of nature, that gives us more information in painting, but feels right than we would get in the natural world, and that makes painting more impactful, more forceful. And then you get this like rich, deep landscape behind her, filled with a heavy weighted atmosphere that is so, like Leonardo thought of air as something that was like tactile and humid. And so that, again, he's thinking through some of those preoccupations that are so defining for him. And then, you know, again, shrouded in mystery, like what is she thinking? There is that coy smile. It is one of those paintings that I think isn't as close to the original condition as it could be. You know, in the Louvre, the French have a different philosophy of cleaning paintings than, say, Americans or Italians or the British. And so, like, there's still some discoloration from the varnish that really obscures our ability to understand the full chromatic complexity of the painting. And that, again, is just like another layer of sort of a veil that kind of we want to look through, but we can't see through completely.
Yeah.
And that's Leonardo in some respects, I think, right? But
yeah.
Yeah.
The creative expression, the freedom to carry to canvas, to wood, to the walls of churches, the concepts he can express through painting, I understand also went against the norm of what tends to be where a painter will sketch its subjects and actually, you know, start with a drawing on canvas, and then go back and essentially do their own paint by number and fill in the sections, and there you have it. And that Leonardo, did not do that.
Well, I'm not sure how accurate that is. I would have to like really get into some of the technical examinations, because he did use a process like often called like cartoons, and this is where you have a 2-scale drawing that is going to be transferred to a type of support like a panel, and he would use panel more than canvas. In fact, one of the things that's pretty fantastic and wonderful about Leonardo is that when he returns to Florence in about 1501, so after he leaves Milan, he's sort of welcomed as this like, you know, famous conquering hero. Like, yeah, great. Like the government of Florence is like, hey, welcome back our celebrated son. And they grant him something like the equivalent of the first one-man exhibition in the history of art. And what he displays is not a finished work, but a cartoon he has as part of a process that he's going to unveil in a final painting that, of course, maybe he doesn't do. But it was like this thing that, like, you know, the people of Florence, like, they flock to see this cartoon, this drawing that he does that is like part of the preparatory process for creating paintings. And he comes from the Florentine tradition where drawing is prioritized, it's privileged and he really sees drawing as a form of knowledge. And so, no, he worked his compositions up in pretty complex stages of drawing, from initial quick studies of figural gestures, like almost like line drawings that are, you know, better than anything I could do. There's a reason that I'm talking about Leonardo rather than trying to paint, right? But then to these far more polished, finished drawings that were appreciated then and now as these celebrated achievements of artistic value.
Of course, he is in rarefied company all on his own, but Albert Einstein apparently was quite a follower of Leonardo, and as an artist and as a scientist, and that Einstein apparently spoke about the connection between science and art, believing that creativity and imagination were essential components of both fields.
I imagine Leonardo would agree. I think, like, you know, his lived experience would kind of like testify to that proclamation. And sure, like him and Einstein seem to be cut from the same cloth. Yeah,
it certainly seemed. And we get a chance to examine that whole cloth coming up very soon here on PBS Fort Wayne. Here's more about the upcoming Ken Burns documentary on Leonardo da Vinci.
He shows us something between what you see and what you don't see. This is the story of the most curious man in history. He was always interested. He never took no for an answer.
There are certain supreme figures in the life of our civilization who fascinate us because they seem to belong to two worlds at once. And Leonardo is supreme amongst all of that kind. The influence of his vision was enormous.
We have an artist leading the scientific discoveries.
He wants to do the impossible.
He's posing questions and looking for answers.
He's doing things no one had ever done before. And that is simply astounding.
November 18th and 19th at 8 o'clock, November 18th at 8, that starts it all, but you can get a preview of this special Ken Burns documentary coming up at Purdue Fort Wayne on November 6th. And you know all about that because Dr. Stephen Cody will be there with you to answer some questions and see where things go.
Yeah, should be fun.
Looking forward
to see
to
everyone
it.
there.
Just like today. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you. This was great.
Appreciate it. Dr. Steve Cody, Associate Professor of Art History at Purdue Fort Wayne. I'm Bruce Haynes with Primetime for all of us here at the station. Thanks for watching. Take care, and we'll see you again next week.